So today with the Killing Fields, I couldn't help but notice, and I'm sure you did as well, that this movie is very, very similar to The Year of Living Dangerously, in that it's both about journalists in Southeast Asia and dealing with the troubles going on and how they're going to get out.
Yeah, I noticed that similarity too. Only this one didn't have the stupid romance subplot.
Correct.
So, I think this is probably the better movie. But even that being said, and I don't know if this is just my mindset when I was watching it, it is a little bit slow. Like, it's a good story. It's a good movie. It's a good movie. It's a good story. At the end, you feel like, oh man, like that's really sweet. But like, there's a lot of times in this movie where it's like, oh my gosh, like this is so long.
It's kind of unnecessarily long. Almost like they didn't have enough story to go off of. And I did feel the same way, that like as good a movie as this is, and it got several Oscar nominations and some wins, and I think it's an important movie to watch, but at the same time, it's not super memorable. Long after, sorry, I say that, sorry, there are multiple scenes in this movie that are super impactful and very memorable, but it's been a month or so since I've seen it now, and that was the second time I'd seen it. It is kind of bleeding over into Year of Living Dangerously, and I had to do a lot of research just now to make sure I didn't start accidentally talking about Year of Living Dangerously and have them kind of too skewed in my mind.
Yeah.
But with Year of Living Dangerously, that was obviously fictional characters within a realistic setting. This is based on two actual journalists in Cambodia at the time. But let's give the brief rundown of the history of Cambodia. I do think it's important, and I don't know why this has always been a kind of emphasis of mine, that as much as we would not like it if an Italian came over here and couldn't tell the difference between Canadians and Americans, at least as far as recognizing that there was a difference culturally and politically and everything like that, I want to try to give that equal respect when we are looking at Southeast Asia and not just lump all these countries together. And so, yes, we've talked about Vietnam and Indonesia, and we're going to get to Cambodia today. And those are all still different countries with different peoples and different histories. And I don't want to just lump them all together casually just because that's not a part of the world we're super familiar with.
Right.
Yeah, so generally speaking, it has, because of the part of the world, you do have similar agricultural things going on. So Cambodia kind of built its society on fishing and dealing with pigs and water buffaloes and growing rice and a lot of things you would expect in Southeast Asia. They were heavily influenced by Indian culture, both religiously and politically and architecturally, and just kind of a lot of influence from India all throughout the history of Cambodia.
And why is that? Because they're not necessarily, like, if you look on a map, I mean, India is closer to Cambodia than the United States is, but it's not like close by.
Correct. And we had seen some of that same influence, though, with India even getting down into farther south into Malaysia and stuff, too. So just India was so powerful. Think of it as how did Macedonia influence Africa? Well, it did, because it was that powerful with Alexander the Great.
So at one point, Indian influence did extend that far, like the actual country, or I guess if you could call it that, of India.
Yes, it wasn't like a Cambodians going to India and bringing back Indian ideas. It was India's influence was that vast in this region, and it kind of couldn't really go much into China, but it went definitely into Southeast Asia and into Indonesia. And Cambodia was definitely one of the most heavily influenced areas by Indian culture, like 1,000 years ago.
Gotcha.
The biggest thing I know Cambodia for is something I've been kind of, not obsessed with, but just very, very interested in going to visit sometime, is Angkor Wat, which was built in the 12th century, and according to one random YouTube video I watched, is the largest religious building in the world. So they kind of had their peak around that time, but they got fighting a lot of their neighbors and kind of fell into decline. And these famous temples, were grown over by the jungle, which is, of course, part of their appeal today, is that you have these 1,000-year-old structures that have basically been swallowed back up by the jungle. And it's kind of because of that they were at their peak 1,000 years ago. Then 700 years ago, they weren't, and everything got grown over. And now today we kind of have these beautiful, iconic things.
And looking at photos of it, it looks like it looks like something you would see in like an Indiana Jones or like a Tomb Raider movie or something.
Absolutely. Angkor Wat is gorgeous, yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if like if some of that stuff is filmed in those areas, or obviously it heavily influences the set designs of movies like that. But yeah, for listeners who they hear Angkor Wat and they're like, I don't know what that is, I guarantee you've seen a picture of it at some point.
Right.
Like when you see a picture of it, you're like, oh, okay, I didn't know that was called that. I mean, I didn't know that was called that, but now that I'm looking at it, it's like, okay, I've definitely seen this before.
Just this absolutely iconic Southeast Asian ancient architecture. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So because they weren't in a great situation, they did kind of agree when Europe started doing their thing around the world. They kind of agreed to become a French protectorate in the 1800s. They basically agreed to kind of become under French control, and then they became a part of French Indochina. It was basically a way for them to actually surprisingly keep some autonomy and not get completely suppressed out of existence by their neighbors. So they kind of got to maintain their identity, I guess.
Which I guess is like, I mean, I don't know what the legal difference is or in practice how it was implemented, but I'm sure that there is, I mean, obviously colonization is not a good thing. But to be a protectorate is probably better than just being straight up
getting wiped out.
You're right, yeah.
Right. And then the Japanese controlled them during World War II, and then they were able to negotiate, similar to what we did see in Indonesia, that following World War II, in 1953, they did declare independence despite the French trying to maintain control. Very much what we saw in some of these other countries, and all about the same time period. Japan kind of comes in, takes everything over, but then in the aftermath of World War II, they're all kind of able to throw off then the European shackles. And Cambodia was definitely in that group. And side note, before I kind of get back into the movie then here today. So something that I feel like we don't really know how to deal with this mindset today. So we think of, honestly, very broad strokes of, Asians and African people and white people, and it's almost too broad of strokes, and we forget that for thousands of years, because people didn't move much, you had very, very small people that still were like, I don't even want to say racially, but like they were independent peoples. We saw that in Europe. You think of something like the Celts or the Huns or the Slavs, and we don't really think of people like that today, but it was important. Like, China is mostly Han, and like those are all actually distinct. I don't know, races isn't the right word, but ethnic groups. So basically these ethnic groups that, again, as American mutts, we don't really think of. And so the reason I mention that is that, so Cambodia is almost exclusively the Khmer people. So they are ethnically Khmer, and actually 97% of Cambodia's population is of Khmer origin. They are a different people, I guess, even ethnically, if you go back thousands of years, than the Vietnamese or the Laotians or the Chinese. And there is a difference. And again, kind of what I was saying before, like I wanted to make sure we kind of recognize that difference. So the dude in charge after they declared their independence was, and again, I have no idea how to pronounce this correctly, but Norodom Sihanouk.
Yes, I thought Sihanouk. I don't know.
And they probably say it in the movie, but the movie's actually kind of after him. So he was the king of Cambodia from 41 through 55, and then he actually basically just took over as their first prime minister as they kind of became independent. But then, and this is now we're getting to about 3 years before the movie. 3 years before the movie begins, he was ousted in a coup. And where this gets really, really complicated, and I would say that this... We talked about how complicated Lumumba was with all the various factions at play and just all the different things. This one's close. I would say it's not quite as bad as Lumumba, but this is very, very complicated. So basically, he was ousted by basically what was a right-wing faction within Cambodia that was also trying to stave off the growing influence of the communists in Cambodia that were influenced by North Korea. And all during this time, the Vietnam War is going on, and some of that is spilling over into Cambodia, and the U.S. is kind of bombing North Vietnamese communist sites in Cambodia, and this guy was kind of mostly okay with it, at least unofficially, as long as they didn't mess with people who were actually Cambodian citizens, and then he was getting ousted anyway. So then the movie today, taking place in 1973, is kind of right as this right-wing government that had taken over is now in a civil war against the communists in Cambodia. So that guy's been ousted, and it's a civil war going on in Cambodia, and then our characters are the war correspondents, foreign correspondents living in Cambodia to write, basically to send stories out to the West about what's going on, because again, they're newspapermen, basically. So as far as, and actually, so the movie actually starts before the communists fully take over. Is that right?
Yeah, well, because when the movie starts, the U.S. is still bombing, like they're still actively engaged in like combat operations in Cambodia as kind of this offshoot from the Vietnam War. Because I think Cambodia, from my understanding, Cambodia was like more or less neutral.
Correct.
Like throughout the Vietnam War, they didn't really take sides, but because they were neutral, they were allowing like North Vietnamese, and Viet Cong dudes to basically, set up camps along the South Vietnamese border. And then, so the U.S. then would bomb these camps. And even though they were in Cambodia, they did it, under the guise of this is part of the Vietnam War. Like, we're allowed to do this because these guys are launching attacks on us and on South Vietnam from here. So like you see, and obviously a ton of civilians died, like tens of thousands of civilians killed in these bombing raids. And, that's one of the first scenes in the movie is Sam Waterston's character. What's his name? Sydney. Yeah, Sydney is trying to get answers about this bombing raid that wiped out an entire village. An entire village of people just wiped off the map in one of these bombing raids. So that's I think where the movie kind of starts. And then not long after, because the communists, the Khmer Rouge, they're led by Pol Pot, because they start to get more support and start to take over the country, and I think this is also about the time that Watergate is going on. So I think that that kind of also influenced this as well. But the United States conducted this Operation Eagle Pole, which you see in the movie, where all the helicopters fly in and start flying out like refugees, and they fly out all the people in the embassy. And that's how that's how his family is able to get out as part of this Operation Eagle Pole, to get all these people out of Cambodia before the communists take over.
Right. The simple rundown of the movie itself, because we've kind of been talking around it, is that, yes, stuff starts hitting the fan in Cambodia, and these journalists are trying to report it while also making sure they survive. And first, this Prawn, a native Cambodian who's working with the Western journalists, gets his family out. Then the Western journalists get out, but fail to get Prawn out. And then kind of the last third of the movie is Prawn trying to escape Cambodia and from a labor camp controlled by the communists that have now taken over the country. And again, it's all based on a true story, though. So that's what's ultra fascinating. And then emotionally cathartic at the end when he does finally get out. And
doesn't Prawn volunteer to stay the first time? Like, he gets his family out, but he's like, "Oh, I'm going to stay behind and help the journalists."
To get the work done.
Right.
And that's why John Malkovich's character is so mad at Sam Waterston, because he's like, you just wanted him to stay and help us get our story when his life is at stake. He might die because you wanted a story.
Right. He could have been out like 5 years earlier if he would have left with his family.
Right.
But he chose to stay.
He volunteered, but it was like Malkovich's character thinks it was coercive volunteering.
Right. Because from his point of view, and it does kind of make sense, when you think about it this way, like Malkovich, and I'm just going to call them by their actors' names because I think of the characters' names. But Malkovich and Sam Waterston, like, they know they're going to be able to get out. Like, they're Americans, they have American passports. They are pretty confident in their ability to be able to basically hit the eject button when they need to. But this Prawn dude, he's making an even bigger decision by choosing to stay, because he doesn't have any of that. When these two American journalists are walking around, like, if they walk up to the British embassy, they're like, "Hey, we're Americans, like, help us out."
Right.
They will, because they're two white dudes. But when Prawn walks up there, he's like, "Hey, oh no, I'm like with these journalists. There's nothing necessarily to show that," which they run into later with the whole passport thing. So him volunteering to stay, it does end up screwing him over a little bit, because then he obviously gets stuck in Cambodia.
Right, and basically then through his eyes, we witnessed the horrors of the Pol Pot Khmer Rouge regime,
which
killed 2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of their population at the time, as the communist left then takes over from the group that overthrew the original guy I mentioned, the king or whatever. And Khmer Rouge actually kind of started as just a nickname. I mentioned it's the Khmer people, and then it's actually, I love in just the title itself of the Khmer Rouge how many things are at play. So the Khmer is the ethnic group, but then Rouge is French for red, and we already talked about the French historical connection. So it just means the red Khmer people. So as in the communist Khmer people. So the Khmer Rouge is the name then for, and then they committed these horrible atrocities as they took power, and basically just like you saw with Stalin in Russia. Or Lenin, and all that, he's killing dissidents. That's basically what was happening here, and you just had the slaughter of the people. And then so our character Prawn, as he's trying to escape, does literally stumble upon the titular killing fields, where I wouldn't even want to call it a mass grave, because the people aren't even buried. And it's just this field of dead bodies that have been there for months, because they're half skeletons covered in rags. And we see this character who's barefoot walking through this, and it's horrifying because it actually happened. And it's just very, very intense. And again, like the highlight of the movie is when he gets home, and this, after 5 years of dealing with these horrors, he finally sees his Western friends and he's able to escape. And then they both went on to, they both were journalists well into the 80s. Actually, they didn't even die. I think Prawn died in 2008. I keep saying, yeah, it is Prawn. Died in 2008, and then Sydney died in 2016 here. So just an interesting friendship that it kind of focuses on dealing with these real life atrocities.
Yeah. And when he's in the camp, it shows the kind of the re-education stuff that they're doing under the what they call the Year One policy, which was basically like the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot's attempt to erase anything before 1975 when they took over. They were erasing. They would say don't ever talk about this.
Oh, right. Specifically Western stuff, but anything, yeah.
Right. We're gonna get rid of it. Like, this is Year One, basically. Like, time is starting right now.
And even getting rid of like Western medicine, so that people were dying of disease that they had basically eliminated in Cambodia. But nope, we don't want Western medicine. So now people are dying of malaria again.
Well, and they even show in the movie, they're like, is there anyone here who's like a teacher or a doctor? Like, we need you. We want your help. And then they just take them and kill them.
Wow, because they were Western educated, and we didn't want that.
Yeah,
knowledge.
Well, I guess it doesn't show it happen, but he says they took these guys. We never saw them again, and then he finds the killing field. He says, "Oh, this is where all these people went."
Right, similar to what you would have seen in Germany with Hitler Youth, where they're just kind of re-educating the kids that this is the only, like you said, this is the only thing that's ever existed. This is all that matters is the now with our new communist regime, and
right.
And am I getting this confused with another movie? Wasn't there a thing with the guy trying to like get his son out or something though, and wanted Prawn to help him? Remind me of that. But then the kid ends up dead, right?
Yeah. So the guy, one of the camp leaders, takes a liking to Prawn. Well, and his son does too, because he's like basically Prawn is like helping this guy out. He's like his assistant, slave, basically.
Right.
And he eventually ends up kind of taking a liking to Prawn and says, "Hey, if I ever like get killed by these guys, because everyone's just killing everybody, he says, will you take care of my son?" Well, the guy gets killed, and Prawn finds out that the son has a map that leads out of the area. Right. So they're trying to follow it, and it's him and another guy and the son. And then the guy that they're with is holding the kid and accidentally steps on a landmine, and it blows him up.
That's right. And then Prawn goes on by himself, right?
Yeah. Which and that's another thing. The whole landmines along the Cambodian border, like millions of landmines placed out there, basically as
they're still finding them, right?
Oh yeah, it's still a huge, there's like millions of acres of land there that's unfarmable because it's full of landmines, and there's all these like NGOs and nonprofits and stuff that are working to, go through and basically minesweep a lot of these fields, a lot of these areas. But there was millions of these things, and a bunch of them are still there, yeah.
So after the events in the movie, Pol Pot, they kind of got a little too big for their britches. They only controlled Cambodia for about a 5 to 7 year window here, until North Vietnam kind of took over and kicked them out. They basically after taking control of Cambodia, they started kind of punching their way into Vietnam after we had left. Of course, I guess there wasn't a North Vietnam anymore. It was just Vietnam as one united communist country. So Cambodia with Pol Pot starts trying to basically mess with them. Well, Vietnam wins and ends up kind of kicking the Khmer Rouge out of Cambodia, or at least out of power. And so Pol Pot was essentially just in exile, or at least, anyway, just had no power anyway.
Yeah, because he had to leave because the Khmer Rouge basically fled to Thailand, right?
Yeah, something like that.
They got kicked out of Cambodia.
So they still existed. Yeah, the Khmer Rouge existed for another 20 years after they got kicked out. They were still, it says they're still active until 1999, and Pol Pot died in 98. But for the last 20 years of that, they were no longer in control of Cambodia. And actually, then our guy from earlier, the president, he was actually king, then prime minister, Norodom Sihanouk or whatever, is now back in charge, as they even said the monarchy was restored. So he becomes the king again in 1993. Until 93, the Vietnamese occupied it, and then the monarchy was restored. So basically, it wasn't even independent Cambodia. Finally, 93 was restored. And that's essentially modern Cambodia. It's essentially a dictatorship. This guy's son is in charge today.
Okay.
Is the king. So the guy who took over, it was the first king in 41. His son in 2020 is still in charge. So with obviously a lot happened in between, but they're not particularly well off. Basically, the tourism industry, because of Angkor Wat, kind of helps keep them afloat. But it's considered a very corrupt country, and it is still a dictatorship. But it's one of those things I want to visit, but I'm a little nervous to visit. And
sure,
but I think it's probably okay. You go with a tour group, kind of like Egypt, I guess.
Yeah, and for Western tourists, you're probably relatively safe, because they want to make sure that you're not probably going to be a victim of the corruption,
Right, because then they don't want to cut that revenue stream off.
Yeah, because that's how the country, most of its income is through tourism and all of the tourism adjacent industries. So, and
let's see. So as a movie, The Killing Fields is a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and won 3 for the guy that played Dith Prawn, Huang Nor. I don't know how to say his name. Again, I suck with Southeast Asian pronunciations just across the board.
Yeah.
He won Best Supporting Actor. It won Best Cinematography, which I'm sure you could speak to, and it won Best Film Editing. Was nominated for Best Picture, Best Director. Sam Waterston was nominated for Best Actor, and it had a screenplay nomination as well. So a very successful, highly critically acclaimed movie. It's not even that, even though we said it was slow, I wouldn't say it's that tough of a sit. It's like
it's not that bad.
It's just a little slow, and maybe could be streamlined a little bit, but
it's like 2.5 hours. I think it's actually just shy of 2.5 hours, like 140 something minutes. But yeah, I think if you cut off maybe half an hour to 40 minutes, it would be a lot easier to watch. But then again, I don't really know where you cut it out, because you are trying to show 5 years worth of time passing.
Right. So, and honestly, we usually refer to movie vegetables as older movies. Maybe there's a little bit of a movie vegetable thing going on here, where you really just need to watch this movie, and
because of the subject matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Just kind of for your own edification. Yeah, it's rough, but a good movie that we definitely recommend. Oh, and the one other thing I wanted to mention is that, so the whole Cambodia, Vietnam stuff, this is where Apocalypse Now happens, is where Martin Sheen's character in Apocalypse Now is going into Cambodia to track down the Marlon Brando character. Now they're not in with all this stuff happening. They're kind of more just in the wilderness as opposed to in the cities, which I should mention, the capital of Cambodia,
Phnom Penh.
Yeah, Phnom Penh, yeah. Which I've heard Phnom Penh many, many times over the years, and it just never clicked in my mind that it was the capital of Cambodia with 2 million people living in it. In my mind, it was almost like a name. It was like a name or something. And I'm like, and even in the movie, they would mention it a lot. I'm like, who are they talking about? I was like, no, that's the capital city of Cambodia is Phnom Penh.
I think that's almost like, as good of a reason as any to watch movies like this, like expose yourself to a movie that's going to talk about place names and geography and, culture stuff like Khmer Rouge that you would not necessarily be exposed to, otherwise, at least not, in the United States. Just get a little cultured.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, and especially Because if I were to tell you to, name the 10 biggest cities in the world, one, you might be wrong. And two, I'm going to list them right now here, according to Wikipedia. And now, this is the largest 10 cities in the world by metropolitan area. So you have Tokyo, followed by Delhi in India, Shanghai, China, Sao Paulo, Brazil, Mexico City, Cairo, Mumbai, India, Beijing, China, Dhaka, Bangladesh, and Osaka, Japan. I don't know if that was about 10. But anyway, it's not necessarily what you think, where it's like, well, where's New York City? Well, it's right after Osaka. But like just the fact that, there's 10 regions, 10 metropolitan areas that are larger than New York City.
And think about, like, in the United States, like, everybody knows about Boston, right? Boston's only like 500,000 people. You say, where's Phnom Penh? No idea. Didn't even know it was a city. Boston's but it's tiny. 4 times the size of Boston.
Exactly. So kind of to our point that there's these giant areas with tons of people and culture and things happening and life going on, and they're way bigger than what we call some of our biggest cities.
I read somewhere that, like, it's either right now or they were saying, like, by 2050 or something like that, 1 in 8 people in the world would live in a city in China. Not just live in China, live in a city in China. 1 out of every 8 people in the world.
That's crazy. Anyway, just kind of like you were saying, Logan, just watch some of these movies for other parts of the world and expose yourself to what else is out there beyond just our own narrow worldview. Okay, so yes, watch The Killing Fields, and that takes us out of Southeast Asia for a little bit. And next week we will be going back to South America and Brazil with the 2002 film City of God.